Throughout its history, Russia has attempted to conceal numerous accidents, disasters, and even crimes against humanity. The classification top secret was applied to the most insignificant incidents. People were denied the right to know the truth, even when it concerned the highest value, human life. And human life has always been held in low regard in this country.
Back in the day, US President Ronald Reagan famously referred to the USSR as the evil empire. Besides Russia's consistent track record of committing crimes against humanity, the ruling class has never dared to admit their responsibility. For decades, many tragedies were concealed from their own citizens and the rest of the world. Even when indisputable facts became public knowledge, Russia continued to deny them, coming up with new and ever more falsifications. Today, we're discussing the most horrific crimes of the Russian regime, which they attempted to conceal then and still endeavor to hide now.
Watch this!
On May 1st, 1986, the residents of Kyiv, like other Soviets, gathered for a festive demonstration. People dressed in their finest with flags and Soviet symbols strolled along the capital's central street. The entire leadership of Soviet Ukraine attended the parade. Children were bringing up the rear of the procession, symbolizing the country's future prosperity. Onlookers included prominent figures from culture, science, politics, and veterans. Everything appeared as in previous years, except for one detail. Previously, these demonstrations lasted 5 hours, but this time it was only 1 hour and 20 minutes. Only a few on the government platform knew that thousands were breathing air contaminated with the radiation. On that day, the radiation level in Kyiv exceeded the norm hundreds of times. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident became the biggest catastrophe in the history of nuclear energy. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, during a test at the fourth reactor, an explosion that completely destroyed the nuclear reactor occurred. Fires started in various areas and on the roof. The accident resulted in the release of radioactive materials into the environment. 2 people near the reactor died directly from the explosion. The initial rescuers who arrived to put out the fire worked without protective gear. They did not comprehend the extent of the reactor's damage. Within a few hours, it became clear that the radiation levels at the plant exceeded permissible limits by hundreds of times. The first group of 28 affected individuals was sent to radiological hospital in Moscow on the same day. All of them died within a month from radiation exposure. After the accident, the radioactive cloud covered not only Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, but also spread to Sweden, Finland, Austria, Norway, and other European countries. So what did the government and party leadership in Moscow do to safeguard the population from radiation and address the consequences of the accident? In the worst traditions of Soviet power, they initially tried to cover up the catastrophe. By the morning of April 26, after assessing the scale of radioactive contamination, it became evident that the Pripyat city needed to be evacuated immediately. Local authorities planned to do this promptly, but Moscow delayed this decision. Evacuation only began on the morning of April 27. This proved a mistake as the wind blew towards the city. The pine forest between the nuclear station and Pripyat turned into the red forest due to radiation. Residents were informed that the evacuation was planned for 3 days and were not allowed to take their belongings. They even left behind their pets, whose fur was contaminated with radiation. In total, around 300,000 people were evacuated from the contaminated zone.
Watch this!
Neither on the 26th nor on the 27th of April, the public was informed of the danger, and no recommendations were given about how to reduce the impact of radiation exposure. The first official announcement of the accident was only made on the third day, under pressure from the international community. The first alarms were raised by the staff of a Swedish nuclear station, who detected radiation contamination. On the 28th of April, the evening program Vremya devoted just 14 seconds to the incident. Even this message contained very little information and gave the impression that the threat was localized. During a time when international media were reporting the life-threatening danger and displaying maps of airborne radiation currents on television screens, mass demonstrations and May Day public festivities took place in Kyiv and other cities of Ukraine and Belarus. The demonstration in Kyiv was organized by the personal order of Gorbachev. In hindsight, this decision was explained as necessary to prevent panic among the population. Furthermore, the government in Moscow did not comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the customs given to school children for the festive parade in Kyiv contained such high levels of radiation that they needed to be returned and decontaminated. Foreign journalists and diplomats who had access to their own media tried to obtain more detailed information about the accident. Of course, nobody provided it. KGB reports includes facts that many foreigners in those days tried to urgently leave Kyiv, but they were persuaded to stay in the city and were even taken on excursions. Moscow sent Kyiv a guidebook describing how to discuss the accident with foreigners and which arguments to use. The official reason for the catastrophe was attributed to human error and not to technological flaws. Foreign journalists were only allowed to interact with agents and personnel from special services who pretended to be ordinary Kyiv residents. What is the cost of lies? This question comes first at the beginning of the HBO series Chernobyl. The cost of those lies was far too high. The attempts by the party leadership and secret services to conceal the catastrophe and then downplay its consequences led to tens of thousands of premature deaths among those involved in the cleanup efforts. The number of affected individuals can only be determined very roughly. Cases of pathologies in newborns, thyroid cancer and other serious illnesses caused by radioactive contamination increased. 37 years after the Chernobyl disaster, many historians and researchers are convinced that the response to this event, the attempts to hush it up, catalyzed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Years later, even Gorbachev himself acknowledged that this tragedy acted as the catalyst for openness that shattered one of the Soviet system's pillars – deception.
Watch this!
For almost 60 years, the Soviet authorities concealed their most heinous crime against the Ukrainian people. The dreadful word Holodomor is now known worldwide. Throughout history, mass famine has been a common occurrence, often associated with crop failures and wars. Even today, underdeveloped countries suffer from this social catastrophe, resulting in loss of life. But it was the Soviet leadership that weaponized it as a means to quell the resistance of Ukrainians against the regime and their attempts to build an independent state free from Moscow's grasp. The first mass famine in Soviet Russia occurred after the Civil War in the years 1921 to 1923. Back then, the government was forced to accept aid from capitalist nations. Negotiations with the American Relief Administration were led by Bolshevik diplomat Maxim Litvinov. The RSFSR was worried that humanitarian aid might be a guise for espionage and subversive activities. Litvinov famously uttered the phrase, "Food is a weapon." The years 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine demonstrated the devastating blow that this weapon could deliver when in the hands of a totalitarian regime. In the 20th century, the independent Ukrainian state only survived for a few years. However, Ukrainian statehood had deep historical roots dating back to Kievan Rus. uniting the nation, reinforcing Ukrainian nationalism, and conflicting with the socialist theory that aimed to dissolve nationalities. When the Bolsheviks occupied Ukrainian territory, they keenly felt this Ukrainian identity and self-identification, which obstructed the existence of the USSR. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin's dictatorship in the USSR solidified, as he aimed to fundamentally transform Soviet society. He constructed an extensive bureaucracy that enforced repressive policies and was responsible for the deaths of millions. The establishment of an authoritarian communist regime brought substantial changes to Ukrainian society and socioeconomic life. First and foremost, these changes affected the traditional village. The regime sought to impose new customs and rituals upon Ukrainians, compelling them to renounce their past and forget their origins. Initially, in the early Soviet period, with the hope of neutralizing the national liberation aspirations of the Ukrainian people, the regime implemented a policy of Ukrainization. The Bolsheviks aimed to win over the Ukrainian masses and strengthen their rule. However, after educating national cards within the nomenclatura, this policy was abandoned, and an onslaught on the spiritual life of Ukrainians began. In the late 1920s, the Soviet leadership embarked on a course of collectivization, combining individual rural farms into collective farms, or as we call them, kolkhozes. Each peasant was assigned a specific number of workdays, for which they received payment in food products. Yet, this compensation was so meager that it was impossible to feed one's family. As a result, the establishment of kolkhozes met with resistance from the peasantry. They were forcibly driven there, using terror and propaganda warfare. In the early 1930s, thousands of mass uprisings by peasants against collectivization were recorded, accompanied by slogans such as "Down with the USSR" and "Long life independent Ukraine."
Watch this!
The sense of national identity among Ukrainian peasants, along with their mental individualism, contradicted the ideology of the Soviet Union. In 1929 to 1932, a campaign of political repression unfolded, involving arrests, deportations, and executions of affluent peasants and their families. They were classified as class enemies, and nearly 2 million people were deported in 2 years. The Kremlin was acutely aware of the threat of uprisings and rural revolts and was unwilling to lose Ukraine. Thus, a plan was devised to annihilate a portion of the Ukrainian nation, camouflaged under grain procurement schemes. Therefore, the regime had two objectives. The first was to force peasants into collective farms and increase grain procurement. The second was to crush the national resistance movement of the Ukrainians. In 1932, an unrealizable plan was set for Ukraine to procure 365 million pots of grain. To implement this, Stalin's close associates, Molotov and Kaganovich, arrived in Kharkiv, then the capital of the Republic. The infamous repressive resolution, popularly known as the 5 Years of Wheat Law, was adopted. Hungry peasants who collected leftover grains in the fields were sentenced to 10 years in labor camps. Special squads were organized to apprehend violators, conducting raids on peasant households and forcibly seizing grain. These raids were accompanied by physical and moral violence against people. Natural fines were imposed, where not only grain, but any other food products were taken from peasants. Such occurrences were unseen in any other Soviet republic. In November 1932, at Molotov's initiative, a new repressive system was introduced: the blacklists. They listed collective farms, settlements, and entire regions that failed to meet the grain procurement targets. Being on a blacklist meant a physical food blockade on collective farms, villages, and towns. These areas were cordoned off by the military and the police. All food was requisitioned and trade was prohibited. Peasants were forbidden from living. During the Holodomor, the black lists were active in a quarter of Ukraine's regions. This measure applied solely to the territories of Ukraine and Kuban, where Ukrainians predominantly resided. The Soviet authorities effectively trapped them within the famine-stricken territory, forbidding them from seeking food in other regions. The peak of the Holodomor occurred in the spring of 1933. Mortality reached catastrophic levels, with 28,000 people dying from hunger every day, which equates to 20 people per minute. These horrifying figures become even more dreadful because all this happened while the grain, taken from the dying Ukrainians, was falling out of the country for export. Stalin needed currency for industrialization. In 1932 to 1933, a mass famine occurred in the other regions of the USSR, including Kazakhstan, the Volga region, and Belarus. But only in Ukraine it became an act of genocide, since it was directed against the Ukrainian nation as a whole. For example, there was no famine in Crimea, which was part of the USSR at the time, while in the neighboring Kherson region, tens of thousands of people perished. Researchers continue to debate the exact number of Holodomor victims. The Soviet authorities meticulously falsified mortality statistics. The Ukrainian Institute of Demography estimates losses at nearly 4 million people, but according to many historians, this is a conservative figure. For decades, mass murder by artificial famine was suppressed and concealed by the Soviet regime. Speaking about it was prohibited. Foreign journalists were forbidden to travel to the affected regions. Death certificates omitted the real cause, and the collection of statistics was banned. The first publications about the Holodomor in Ukraine began to emerge only in the late 1980s. In 2010, the Appellate Court of Kiev recognized the Holodomor as a genocide and named its chief organizers. The leaders of the Bolshevik totalitarian regime, Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Kosyr, Postyshev, Chubor, and Hatayevich, were convicted. The latter four were executed by Stalin during the Great Terror as unnecessary witnesses to his crimes. However, these tragic events were not a secret in the West. Raphael Lemkin, the author of the term genocide, described the Holodomor as a classic example of Soviet genocide against Ukrainians. Today, it is considered one of the most horrific crimes against humanity. As of October 2023, 32 countries worldwide have recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. Several other countries have condemned it as an act of humanity's destruction, committed by the Stalinist regime. Naturally, Russia is not among these nations.
Watch this!
The plane crash that occurred on the morning of April 10, 2010, near Smolensk, claimed the lives of the President of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, and 95 others. His wife, prominent Polish politicians, public figures, and nearly the entire top military command also perished. It became a national tragedy for Poland. Coincidentally, the deceased were flying to commemorate another national tragedy, the Katyn Massacre. Both of these events were attempts by Russia to conceal and falsify the truth. On August 23, 1939, in Moscow, the foreign ministers of Nazi Germany and the USSR, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, accompanied by a secret protocol. This agreement divided spheres of influence in Eastern Europe and mandated the independence of sovereign states. For the Polish Republic, this effectively meant its fourth partition. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, and within 2 days, the Polish-German conflict escalated into World War II. The Soviet Union remained neutral for the first 2 weeks, maintaining an appearance of neutrality. However, when it became clear that Poland could not withstand the aggression of Nazi Germany, the Red Army invaded its territory on September 17th. The Red Army occupied the territories of western Ukraine and western Belarus, which had been part of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires until 1917. There were numerous cases of reprisal against Polish border guards, police and officers during the Soviet invasion. For example, after the capture of Grodno, about 300 prisoners, including officers, cadets, soldiers, and even schoolchildren, were executed. Vigilante justice and executions occurred, with Soviet soldiers going unpunished or receiving minor sanctions like 15 days of arrest. In total, during the Soviet occupation of Poland, almost 500,000 Polish citizens were taken prisoner. Most of them were released shortly thereafter, but about 130,000 people were sent to NKVD camps. After transferring some Poles to the Third Reich and releasing regular prisoners, Soviet camps held nearly 22,000 Polish officers. There was no legal basis for detaining these individuals. They were not prisoners of war, because Moscow had not declared war on Poland. They were not criminals under Soviet law either, since they had never lived in the USSR. The reason for their execution was explained by Lavrenti Beria, the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, in memorandum to Stalin. All of them are sworn enemies of Soviet power, filled with hatred for the Soviet system. On March 5, 1940, the Politburo of the Bolshevik Party decided to execute them. From early April, Polish prisoners were transported to execution sites. Those from Ukrainian prisons were taken to Kyiv, Kherson and Kharkiv for execution, while those from Belarus were taken to Minsk. The Polish prisoners believed they were being transported for release, so their spirits were high. In Katyn forest, about 4,500 people were executed. It was the first mass grave to be discovered. Later, the term Katyn Massacre was used to describe all executions of Polish prisoners that took place in April-May 1940 in various camps and prisons in the USSR. Vasily Blokhin, the chief executioner of the Stalin era, personally supervised the executions in Katyn forest. In total, nearly 22,000 Poles were executed in all designated locations. The executions took place from early April to mid-May 1940. Among those people were career officers, mobilized lawyers, teachers, journalists, engineers, and university professors. Some of the most well-known victims included Janina Lewandowska, a pilot executed in Katyn, General Stanislav Haller, who defeated Semen Budyonny in 1920, and General Franciszek Sikorsky, the commander of Lviv's defense. Interestingly, the Lviv garrison had surrendered to the Red Army with the condition of safe passage abroad. But did the Russians fulfill their promises?
Watch this!
After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Smolensk and the Katyn forest came under occupation. The Germans discovered mass graves of Poles, interrogated residents, and conducted extensive exhumations. Professor Gerhard Butz led this effort. On April 13, 1943, German radio reported the discovery of the remains of 10,000 Polish prisoners of war executed by the NKVD near Smolensk. The Germans approached the International Red Cross, but Stalin prohibited any actions on the occupied Soviet territory. Subsequently, the German administration formed an international commission. It included representatives of their allied nations, but led by a Swiss doctor. Based on substantial evidence and witness testimonies, it was proved that the NKVD carried out the mass execution. The Polish government in exile supported these findings, which led to a breakdown in relations with Moscow. Throughout the war, the Germans actively used the execution fact in their propaganda. After the liberation of the Smolensk region, a Soviet commission led by academician Burdenko was formed. Naturally, its conclusions were entirely contradictory. The Soviets claimed that the Poles were shot by the Germans. The results of this pseudo-investigation were even attempted to be used as the Nuremberg trials, but were dismissed. Until the end of the USSR, its leadership denied any responsibility for the execution of innocent Polish citizens. Only in 1990 did the Soviet government admit that the shootings were carried out on direct orders from Stalin and his subordinates. Gorbachev presented the discovered in the archives documents to the Polish leader, Wojciech Jaruzelski. When Putin came to power, he repeatedly condemned the Katyn Massacre as a crime of the Stalinist regime. However, with the worsening relations between Russia and Western countries, the Soviet narrative that the Poles were shot by the Germans finds more supporters. There is a political motivation from the state behind this. Following the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Polish flag was removed from the memorial complex in Katyn. Russian pseudo-experts are trying to invent new versions and manipulate facts on this issue. However, they did the same during the investigation of the plane crash near Smolensk, which claimed the lives of Poland's political and military elite. Initially, the Interstate Aviation Committee in Moscow and the Polish Military Prosecutor's Office handled the case. The primary cause of the crash was cited as erroneous actions by the crew. They decided to land in adverse conditions, ignoring warnings of a dangerous approach to the ground. But various hypotheses and theories soon emerged, suggesting that Russia was responsible for orchestrating a terrorist attack. The iconic moment for these allegations was images of Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk embracing Putin at the crash site. After the Law and Justice Party, led by the Kaczynski brothers, won the parliamentary elections in 2015, Poland initiated a new investigation led by Defense Minister Antony Macierewicz. The new authorities accused members of Tusk's government of negligence and even treason. The presentation of the result of this new investigation was expected on the 10th anniversary of the tragedy, but Russia refused to release the wreckage of the crashed plane and even prevented new investigators from examining it. Everything changed with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It compelled a different perspective on the crash. According to Antony Macierewicz, it was a prelude to what is currently happening in Ukraine. On April 10, 2022, the brother of the late President Yaroslav Kaczynski claimed that Moscow's interests were behind the plane crash. The following day, Macierewicz presented a report. The commission identified traces of explosives on many parts of the presidential plane and concluded that the explosion occurred in the left wing. Simultaneously, the commission was convinced that Russia was behind this intervention. Those who had believed in Russia's capability for years finally had proof. However, these results did not satisfy everyone. The former head of the State Investigation Commission claimed that no new evidence had been presented. The investigation into the Smolensk crash divided Polish society and has been used for political purposes by various players. Despite disagreements within the Polish political landscape, in December 2022, the Sejm of the Republic of Poland passed a resolution and recognized Russia as a state that supports terrorism and is responsible for the crash.
Watch this!
Many catastrophes and tragedies in Russia have indeed been met with attempts to suppress, falsify, or deny them. This includes the loss of the passenger ship Admiral Nahimov, the Kursk submarine, as well as the horrific events during the hostage crisis at the Beslan School and the Nordost Theater. Unfortunately, it has become an axiom that human life in Russia is devalued. Sufferings, numerous victims, and the mocking smirk of the ruling class seem to be the norm in this country. To be continued.